In my house lives this cute little fairy who collects bits and bobs that I would normally throw away, and she makes the most beautiful things out of them. She lives underneath my well-used pin cushion, and there is another one of these gorgeous little pin cushions that I made a really long time ago, but I still use them and I enjoy them a lot. The big dolls are also watching me play and work, and there are some flower fairies in my home also. Hello, I am Maud, and in this video I'm taking you along in doll making. I use special materials for doll making, and I will put a list down below of what I use, but here you can see some pictures of the things that I bought in special doll making stores. There is a variety of skin tones that you can choose from, and I use all kinds of really strong threads and DMC or Gutermann sewing threads. And these dolls you can make with these pipe cleaners or use electrical wire. And obviously you also need your sewing box with all your sewing equipment and some really large doll needles. So let's dive in. You normally know me as a journal maker, but I also was a doll maker for many, many years. And here I'm showing you the different kind of tubing that I have installed. That I have in my house. Sorry. And for this particular doll, I was testing what kind of tubing I would need to make her head. And well, I can't stop playing with her. I still think she's really cute. I am testing, just eyeballing what kind of tubing I would use, and I'm thinking that I will make a new tube myself out of this underlaying, what is it, tricot. You can buy this in special doll stores. Sometimes I hear people using t-shirts, but if you want to make really strong, durable heads and really stuff them, then a t-shirt you might pull apart, and that would be a shame of all your work. And that is something, instead of when I do the junk journaling with old materials, and well, sometimes the paper is so brittle and you can just glue it onto a sturdier piece. With doll making, you really need good materials. If you don't, you will end up with tearing your own doll apart, because there's going to be a lot of tension on the fabrics. I use Gutermann threads or DMC threads because they are really strong and they won't break. And normally I will use a 2-strand to do the sewing with, and I use really thin needles. That is my personal preference, and I also find that the really thin needles help me get through the fabric more easily. And here you see me threading this needle and putting or taking 2 strands. I also use some beeswax. I bought this in a quilting shop, and I take the thread through the beeswax, and that way it won't curl on me and it won't make any knots while I'm stitching, and that makes my life a whole lot easier. And I don't knot the ends of the threads. I just put a few stitches over each other, and here you see me testing out which side I want eventually to come on the outside, so I have to put the part that I like the least on the inside. Now you see me make a couple of stitches, and in that way I'm securing the thread. I was thought to make these dolls in the traditional Waldorf style, but I have been making dolls for over 15 years, and I have changed the style up a bit to make it my own. And I am not a really Steiner kind of person. I love these dolls and I love what they stand for in the traditional Waldorf way. But I'm not a traditional Waldorf style doll maker, although lots of the ways that I make these are traditional. I don't felt any noses on them. I don't needle felt their faces. Not yet. Maybe I will do that in the future because, well, I have watched some other doll makers that were quite advanced in making these heads out of felt. They felt the wool that you see here on the left side. And that's also really nice. Maybe I will do that in the future, but for now, this is just the old way of doing things. So I am rounding this corner so that the head will get a natural round. And I'm doing back stitches, really small stitches. So I'm making sure that I'm making a really strong seam. And I will speed this process up and also skip a bit because, well, you get the idea of stitching this. You could also do this on your sewing machine, but then I would recommend you do the seam twice because that way you get a much stronger seam. But I love to do these things by hand. It makes me feel calm and yeah, well, I just love the process of slow stitching, hand stitching. But this particular tube you could also do quite easily on your sewing machine. Then you might consider taking a bigger seam allowance and then later on cutting it short. Because, well, your sewing machine might catch on the fabric and pull it down in your machine. Also, to tie off the end, I'm not making a knot, just putting a few stitches over each other because, well, that's just my way of doing things. Putting my needle on my pin cushion. And I'll be cutting the seam allowance a lot shorter and rounding it off. Turning this tube is quite easy because it is a rather wide tube. I'm bending her knees again so she can sit and watch me work. I love to have these dolls around me. Yeah, maybe it's just me. But here you see that this tube has become, yeah, a little less wide and a little wider than the really big one. I have some wool leftovers that are perfect for the center of the head. And to make the head, I also need to take off some strips of this wool. And this wool was, I bought a sheep's skin. Well, just the wool. And I have cleaned it myself. And this is also wool that you can buy in the stores. I use this mostly for the legs and the arms, But if you can only get this wool, then it is perfectly fine to make a head out of, at least of this small size. But you need approximately a part like this. Because I've cleaned this wool myself, there are still some bits in there, but I will get them out once I will take the little strands of wool. For the center, I'm making this little ball of wool from the leftover bits. And you see that is already a nice ball. I know that there are people who are using vegan material to make these dolls. I have never tried that myself. I always use wool. So I cannot tell you if the vegan material works just as nice or that it doesn't, because I have no experience with it. I'm making a star pattern of little pieces of wool. And this is quite important that you do this star all around, because this is going to be the outside of the head, and you want the head to be without any bumps and lumps. But this part can go right in the center of the star. Then I take the wool and turn it around, and you can see that it is already a really nice ball of wool. I measure the circumference of the head over the head from the neck onto the neck. There are different kind of ways of doing this, but this is my way. And now I have to get all this wool into this tube. And this is a tricky bit, but if you have a nice ball made out of your wool, the wool has kind of a remembrance and it will come together as a nice ball again. You do need some wool sticking down from, in the neck, because if you have no wool at all in the neck will become really wobbly, and well, your doll will have a problem keeping her head up straight. And now I'm showing you, if the ball is not big enough, then you can pull the wool open and find the center more or less, and from the center you can push some wool back into the head, and this way when you push it in the center of the head, you don't alter anything on the outside, so you don't get any lumps and bumps. This is 11, so it is short because I want my head to be 12 centimeters. So I need to put a lot more wool in there, and off camera I will pull it open and stuff some more wool in there. But I'm showing you here how to tie the neck off. I take a double strand of really strong cotton. And for these little dolls you can take just regular really strong cotton. And if you turn the cotton around 3 times and pull on it really hard, you can just let the strings go, they pull tight on themselves, and measure the head again. Measuring. Here you see that I've now got 12 centimeters circumference. And if I'm saying any words wrong, then please tell me what it should be. Because, well, with paper crafting, I am really knowledgeable of all the words, but in doll making, that is new territory for me. So please tell me if I need to say some words differently or anything. You see my head is rather egg-shaped on the back side. That is because I did the seam not round enough, but well, some people have an egg-shaped head as well, so that is something that you could correct or something that you could just accept. All the lengths of thread are pulled through the head before I cut them, so that way no knots will come loose. And if your strand is too short, then just put the needle through the head first and then put the strand of thread through the eye of the needle again. I pull them really tight and now they are really secure. And I cut them off by putting my scissors next to the head, squeezing into the head, and the strands of thread will just disappear inside the head. I can still mold my head a little bit, but not a lot, because it is really firm. I now take 2 pins and see where I want the ears to be. These pins have to be at the middle of the face to get a nice doll face. If you put them up too high, your doll might look a little dumb. And if you put them up too low, your doll might end up looking cross. But every doll maker has her own signature in head making. If you think you're going to make exactly the same dolls like me, especially the faces, then I have to disappoint you, because, well, like our own handwriting, it is also that all the doll makers have their own like signature on the faces of the dolls. And it's really your own preference in what way you would like to make them. Your first couple of dolls, you might think, well, and that's not exactly what Maud did. Well, let me assure you that my first dolls were not like this. Practice makes perfect, and this is a wonderful way of making dolls' heads, but it's not really easy in the beginning. This is the chin line, and I'm getting a little bit off camera, correcting it quickly. You tie the chin line on top of the head. Make sure it is in the center again. And really tie it off strongly. If by this time you are completely pulling your head almost flat again, then it means that there's not enough wool inside your head. And I wanted to correct the ear lines here a little bit. All these strands of thread, you have to keep them apart, so this is a little fiddly in the beginning. I like to do 3 or 4 knots, knotting my doll off, and that's easier when I have it tied to my own body. But I did four knots, I think. I do the 4th now on camera. The first 2 are obviously a little bit difficult because you have to keep these threads really tight. And make sure that your threads are not dissecting the head in 2, because then there's really not enough wool inside your head, and also you won't get a nice result. So then you have to open the whole thing up again and put some more wool in there. And I'm using these strands to fixate the ear threads. Now I can take my pin out, and I'm doing a cross stitch over these lines, and that way I'm securing the chin line to the eye line. And of course other threads want to interfere. I'm also picking up the tubing underneath, and also picking up some wool, and that way everything is really secure. And the way I do it, every little thread, before I cut it, I take it through the head again. And I'm so used to doing that I never forget. I just never cut off any threads just near a knot. So the other ear gets attached in the same way, also again with a cross stitch, and also picking up some wool and some of the tubing. Getting rid of all the strands. And now I have to pull the eye line at the back of the head down towards the neck. And if this doesn't work with your nails, then you could also use I will put that word right in here because I can't remember the name at the moment. A crochet hook, that's what it is. You could also do this with a crochet hook. And now I want to attach the threads together, and here I'm just picking up the threads of the chin line. I don't pick up any fabric or any wool, and I'm doing this with the back of the line too. So I'm just picking up the threads and not any of the other materials. Doing that again. So if you put your needle flat next to the line and then push it under, that's the best way to pick up just the threads. And now I can pull on these lines, and they are nicely put together. And with a few stitches, and this time I am going through the fabric and the wool, I'm securing this well, you can see what I'm doing. And again, pulling my thread through the head before I cut off any string. And by now you can see the shape of the head coming along. So I have to do the same on the other side. I hope you can see what I'm doing. So picking up just the thread, going to the other side, just picking up the thread again. One more time in the front. And then pulling the strands of thread together, making sure there's no fabric in between. And pushing the doll face into shape. I want everything to be nice and round, no lumps and bumps in there. And you do want some wool, like I said, in the neck, but not too much, because otherwise, yeah, your doll would look like a wrestler with a really strong neck. Now I am auditioning all kinds of skin tones, and this was just a perfect piece because, well, this little square will be enough for this doll. I am looking at what side do I want the outside to be. I hope you can see that this is a little bit fuzzy and the other side isn't. So the side that isn't fuzzy is going to be the outside in the end, but has to be on the inside now. And I'm measuring the top of the head. I'm folding the fabric over and putting a pencil mark where my neckline is. And the stretch of the fabric should be, yeah, what way? The stretch should go that way that you can pull it over the head. If you put the stretch, yeah, the stretch should be horizontally. If you put it vertically, you won't be able to get this fabric over the head. Well, again, I am doing the sewing by hand. This is just my personal preference. You could also do this on your machine again, but this time you have to leave the top side completely open, because that is the side that your head will going to be pulled through, because, well, the neck is a little bit narrower and you won't get that big head through the neck. I'm realizing here that I did not use the beeswax on these threads, and that way they are curling and giving me some trouble. I work with really long strands of thread because I don't want to start over and in the middle of my seam that I'm making, because that way you get a part of the seam that won't be as strong as when you do this all at once. Again, you could do this on your sewing machine, but then take a bigger seam allowance if you are stitching and do this seam twice. I am using back stitching to do this seam, and well, I'm doing a voiceover. I can't remember if I'm doing this whole seam on camera or if I fast forwarded. And here you also see my crochet hook. I got it out because well, I just wanted to show you. Use the tiniest stitches that you can make, and that will make the strongest seam. And also, well, there is going to be a wig over this doll. The seam is always going to be at the back of the head, but yeah, you don't want any under fabric peeking out of your doll's head. I'm rounding the head here and going towards the neck. You could also do this just a straight tube, but that would leave you probably with some wrinkles of skin fabric, and that's something I don't like. But that was what I was thought traditionally, and some of the skin fabrics are also really yeah, pliable, and they don't wrinkle as much. This is a rather sturdy fabric. I bought this in the Netherlands, but I do know that doll makers these days get their fabrics from Switzerland. Well, obviously, doll stores import these fabrics for you, and they are so beautiful, I'm told. But I still have these, so I'm working with these. This stitching makes me really calm. I told you before, but it does. And I have all these ideas of what I want to do with the doll making, and I want to incorporate some of my junk journals in here also. And while the doll on the right is a doll that belongs to that pin cushion, this doll that I'm making now will be a fairy that will be like a book fairy with, and she will go with my fairy journal. And I will link the serie of my fairy junk journal down below, the playlist. So if you are interested, you can also see the fairy junk journal that I made, that this doll is going to be a part of. And now I'm cutting off the seams. And because I did really small stitches, I can get away with a really small seam allowance. And turning this part also. And now I have to make sure that this seam comes at the back of the head. And this is the way to put this on. It is rather fiddly to because everything is really tight. So I have these hemostats to pull this through. And nearly every doll maker has these. They're surgical equipment, but a lot of doll making stores also sell these. And really pulling on this fabric, so that's why you need really strong fabric to do this, because there's a lot of tension on this fabric. I'm pulling and pulling to get everything in place. And that's why you also want a really strong seam, because you don't want to rip your seam at this stage, because then, well, you just basically have to redo the whole tube with the skin color. Because this is a really small doll, I just used sewing thread to bind off the neck. And you can see some wrinkles there, but if I bind it off and pull on it again, I will get rid of the wrinkles. Pulling and pulling and pulling on this fabric, so that's why it needs to be so strong. And smushing out any wrinkles by smooshing and pulling again on the fabric. Tying the neck off with a few knots. and pulling on the fabric again. Putting pins in place so I can start closing the gap at the top. And for this I'm also using a double thread, because there's going to be a lot of tension on the top of that hat also, on the fabric and on the seam that I'm going to make. And this time I'm using a small needle again, because I will make some really small ladder stitches. And if you don't know what ladder stitches are, well, watch me make them or else look them up in any sewing book, because a ladder stitch is something that you use a lot on doll making. And I have a knot in there. I want my ends to meet, and I'm using the beeswax again. This is something I just do to make my life a lot easier. Going through the head to the starting point. Leave a bit of thread inside the head and make a few stitches again to secure the thread in place. Making sure everything is aligned. So a ladder stitch is basically a stitch on one side, going back to the other side, really close to the stitch you made previously. Do a stitch there and go back to the front side. And this time you're just stitching in the upper fabric. Not taking up the fabric that is underneath. And I did not secure my stitches very well, so this is what happens. But you don't want this to happen at the end, so I'm starting over. Doing 3 stitches, so it's really secured. And there are still some holes in there from my first attempt. So make a few stitches and then start pulling on the threads, and then you see a nice little seam coming along, which closes the head off really nice. And again, just pick up the upper fabric, because that way you can pull on the fabric and pull it backwards. That's something I'm going to do just now. And well, this is a bit of a scary part, but I'm cutting off the excess fabric, making sure I don't cut the thread. And now I'm going to pull the seam backwards using the ladder stitch. So you can see I am pulling it backwards quite a lot. Excuse my dog, she sees some people that she's annoyed with, I think. So going through the head and doing the other side. And you don't need a big seam allowance if you are making small stitches. And also because this fabric is really strong. Because if you were to use fabric that is not strong enough, you will probably have a difficult time keeping a small seam allowance because your fabric will tear. And now comes the daunting bit again of cutting off a little piece of fabric. When I made my first dolls, this was the time that worried me a lot. And I did end up cutting my threads. Pulling this seam backwards also. So there will, when I put a wig on, you won't see any stitching in her face. And then going through the head again and finishing it off with a couple of stitches. And I'm quite pleased with how this head turned out. My heads are always a little oval. When you push them down, you can make them round. But that's kind of my signature, my signature in doll making. I have an oval head myself, and my teacher used to say that, well, dolls will look a little bit like the ones who makes them. So yeah, maybe that's because that's the reason why my heads are always a little oval. I don't know. But they are. I'm taking my big needle again, my doll making needle, and putting these through the head again before I cut them off. And that is what I do all the time. So I'm hoping this was really helpful to you. I wish I could invite you all and come to my home, and I would do these doll lessons really gladly in person, because that way I could explain a lot more. This video is already quite long, but give yourself the time. Making doll heads can easily take you up to an hour for making your first head. So pause this video, start it again. Yeah, don't be disappointed about the outcome of your first head. Do it over again, or just do a new one. And you probably need to make a couple of these doll heads before you master this technique. But it is a lovely technique, and well, I love these dolls really a lot, and I hope you do too. So these are a few close-ups of this doll head, and if you want to see more doll making videos, I am planning to do more in the future. So subscribe and join me again. Bye bye.